Thank you. So today's sermon actually has come from a devotional. I normally read a daily devotional. This is also I can share who it is. So it's a company called United Christian Broadcasters. They're in obviously the UK, and they have a daily devotional. It's on every day, so obviously you can sign up for that as well. It seems to be actually very prolific. So the couple that actually have compiled the daily devotional, it's very interesting. Every time I read the daily devotional, it's just relevant for the day. So it must be very biblically thought and found out about that it has an impact on so many people all over the world. So yeah, 2:06. Just trying to see if I can change this. Is the 2:06? I might just have to stop again. Sorry, I'll just try and reshare. Um, all right, okay, it's here. Right, I'm here. Yeah. So today's sermon really came about from this devotional, which was about last week. And it really was very interesting, and I thought it was very apt for me at the moment, especially feeling low in energy and tired. And I really kind of wanted to start off with, because obviously the sermon was really covering the life of David. And I think the first thing really to start off with in this slide is really circumstances now are placed for the future. So your circumstances at this point in time will also affect your future. So it's basically bringing God into your circumstances. So God skill is used for his purposes. So obviously there is a lot in the story of David, and obviously we will cover some things today. I may consider doing a part two on this book on David because there is a lot about David's life. But I think the thing that really kind of popped out to me from this devotional that was on that day, it was all about your skill. It was covering the two topics of your skills and your gifts. And I think it was very much a thing that can apply to everyone who is a believer, is that God will give you a gift or a skill, but it's very interesting where that gift or skill will take you. So the analogy here of David, he was a musician, he was a harpist, he played the harp, and he managed to get in to King's palace. So he actually played in front of Saul, and obviously from that as well, he was managing to witness and became obviously very influential. So it's very the kind of really crutch of today's message is don't underestimate the skill that God has given you, because it will take you places, and it will take you to places that you may not expected to go to. But again, you're used as a vessel of God, and from that you can create a lot of influence. And I think particularly in David's life, um, his life, from doing a lot of the research, his life was very much up and down. So he obviously had times where he was really, he's basically named as a man after God's heart. So obviously he was very passionate about serving the Lord. But obviously, he also had other times in his life while he was rebelling from God as well. And we see this in the Psalms. So sometimes within the Psalms, he was praising God, but sometimes he was asking for forgiveness because obviously he had committed a sin. So again, his life was very up and down, but his main aim of his life was always to serve the Lord. So David in the Bible was a musician, and he was also a warrior. And we see here, obviously, in the 70, so David wrote 73 of the 150 Psalms. So it's just under half. But there was three Psalms I wanted to kind of point out to you here, which I thought were very relevant. So Psalm 23 is covering really the kind of high level overview is God's provision, protection, and guidance. Psalm 51 is the plea for mercy, forgiveness, and for God to create a clean heart in David. And Psalm 142 is a lament expressing hopelessness and isolation. So we see in the Psalms for David, sometimes he feels far from God and sometimes he feels close to God, but always the aim of the God, as with David, is a man after God's own heart. So it's always looking at bettering his character. And I think it's very interesting It's character development is mentioned here twice. And I think as being a believer, and when you're going on a journey, once you become saved and continually on your Christian journey, God's always working on your character. So I have the analogy, and obviously odd enough, there's a tree behind me in my backdrop, and I always think it is a biblical terminology with trees as well. And I think I have covered this in a previous sermon that God likes to cut and prune us to make our better people. So the things to make us more like Jesus. So as a believer and as people to see that. So your character now will also determine your future. And I think particularly with the open doors, obviously that it was covered probably a couple of months ago when I played one of the songs in worship was about opening doors, as I think it's all in God's timing. So once God develops your character to a certain level, doors will open. And the good example here is of David playing the harp and gets it obviously into the palace and obviously in front of the king. So influential. So David, as a human being, was very humble. So there is also in the Bible, it talks about the well-known line or sentence, "The meek shall inheritance the earth." And I think when I was covering David's life, it had a lot of legacy. I was more thinking towards the end of his life and what all of the things he'd accomplished and what all the things he'd done in terms of uniting nations, being a king, serving people. And I think the thing that, particularly with David's life, is what do we want to remember David by? And then I would fling that question back to you as where you are. What do you want to be remembered for? And what does God want you to be remembered for? That's always a thing good to think of in your life at the moment and of your future decades to come is what do you want to do for the Lord and what do you want to be remembered by? It's always a question to think. And I think particularly in his humbleness, um, particularly in David's family, he was the smallest, but obviously he was a shepherd boy, and during his time, he would also, kill animals and protect his flock of sheep. And that was obviously good training ground when he then had to be used to kill Goliath, who was it does say in the Bible, it's about triple the size of what David is. And as I'm sharing the story of David and Goliath, and I will just do a book plug. I actually have written my very first children's book was on the story of David and Goliath, and it was just very interesting drawing all the pictures. And I think particularly with the David and Goliath scenario, I would have to then have David as very small and obviously Goliath as a giant. But that was the thing, obviously, that in particular in this story, in being humble, God will lift you up. And in this case, obviously give you the armor for your battle. In this case, obviously defeating Goliath. So the aim here really in David is obviously bringing people together, uniting tribes, being the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant, when I was doing the research, is very much looking at the religion and the political capital of Israel. So it's a symbol of God's presence among the Israelites and Jerusalem. And it's to make Jerusalem holy, or it's also known as a holy place. And this is probably very relevant for now because obviously Jerusalem is still classed as a sacred place. And there is in Jerusalem as well, there's a wall where obviously a lot of people put their prayer requests, which obviously have a lot of influence all over the world. And again, a lot of people visit from all over the world to visit Jerusalem. And in David's life as well, in terms of being a legacy, he was the precursor to Jesus. So obviously he was in the same lineage as Jesus and also was classed as a son as well. Very interesting in David's life as well. Obviously, David's own son would naturally be the natural heir to take over after David had passed. But this was actually passed to Solomon, which David was David picked Solomon basically because Solomon walked in God and was very wise. And I think really it's interesting with this whole thing as being a king. And I think particularly the humbling experience It's going back to the Bible, the Lord will lift you up, obviously, if you become less of yourself and more of God. And I think it was very positional, where obviously David became the king after encompassing some tasks and activities. And I think particularly because of David, as it is also listed in the Bible, he had a servant heart. He had a heart for serving people. And again, from that, God will elevate you into your situation. So David's life in 2 Samuel 23, verse 1, it classes him as a sweet psalmist of Israel. He relied on God. He had a continual pursuit of a relationship to be with God and was part um, of God's plan. And he was again a man after God's own heart. So we see particularly in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, um, David had 16, there's 16 facts to find out about, obviously, David. Again, I may cover this more in depth in a part two session. But obviously, David was from a tribe of Judah. David was Ruth and Boaz's great grandson. He was the youngest of seven sons, again, being the smallest, obviously having very influential power. And I think, particularly with three, as I've also read as well, with his other sons who were preparing for army, he would actually bring them food, but he would not necessarily be in battle. He would be more like the back end support or the serving support. David was in Bethlehem. He was anointed by God. He was a shepherd, obviously tending to sheep. He was a musician, playing a harp, and he was a giant slayer, so obviously killed Goliath. He was also a warrior. So he's had a kind of very warrior mentality. He was Israel's great king, obviously being a king of Israel. He committed adultery with Bathsheba. He plotted to have Uriah killed, following from point 11. He was a man after God's heart. He lived around 1000 BC before Christ. He had 8 wives, and he also wrote about half the book of Psalms. So in David's life as well, it is very much up and down. And again, we may cover this in a part two, particularly all the other areas that he's been involved in. So the Psalms here really are laments. Obviously, it's providing an overview of his life. It's giving God's promises. It's a fulfillment in Jesus of the Father to Son. So David, obviously, as the book of David and in the Psalms, it's very much he's a prominent figure in the Old Testament. So obviously he had a legacy, he had a mission to perform while he was on earth. And his aim obviously was to point people to God and to rule his people. And again, he laid the foundations before Jesus came to earth as a sinless human. He wanted to save and rule to serve humanity. So obviously to get them to turn to Christ. And I think particularly with today's subject topic being about doors, so doors obviously will open. And again, I think the doors will open once you are ready to be ready to serve God. And from that, and in God's timing, then the doors will actually physically open. Also, we see as well it's an eternal destiny and it's the kingdom through one of his descendants. So, God promised to establish David's house and kingdom permanently, as we saw, obviously, he became the king of Israel. He obviously had a special father to son relationship as well. So, in David's life, he was God's chosen person. Obviously, we saw as well, he was God's holy land. He was a God's appointed leader. And obviously, he obeyed God's laws. In point two, it's very interesting because the father-son relationship is the same as Jesus to God. So there's a father-son relationship. And I think that's very good to look into because obviously it's the obedience of the father to the son. And from this as well in that relationship, it led to both a fullness and a rich life. So the discipline here was obviously that David's through his, if you read the books of the Psalms, his main aim always was to do the will of the Father. And he was always looking at being obedient to the Father. And in some Psalms as well, he would ask for forgiveness or repentance because obviously he wanted always to be in the Father's will. And he always wanted the loving kindness of the Father. So David also as well was the son of Jesse. He was the shepherd boy of Bethlehem. He was chosen by God and he was fulfilling God's will. And it was obviously finding from this as well God's will for your life. So the 5 areas as we've listed here, obviously he worshipped God, obviously through obviously obedience to God and prayer to God, but also praising God, obviously through music. It does also say as well he danced as well. He was obedient to the law, obviously the Ten Commandments. He had a faith and trust in God, but also we see in some of the Psalms as well, he had a repentant heart. So from that as well, he would be convicted if he's done wrong or been sinful, and he would also be humble. So that was always the thing. He had again a servant heart. And again, 4 and 5 is very similar. It's obviously the words repeated twice, but he also wanted repented. So what we see sometimes in a lot of the Psalms that David would hide away from God because he obviously knew he'd done wrong, but he would also ask for God's forgiveness again to heal himself and to cleanse himself. And then we see in the New Testament, again, with the lineage from David, precursor to Jesus, is obviously that kingdom authority, having that kingdom culture, and obviously seeing obviously as the everlasting life in God through the kingdom. David's deep faith and obedience and praise, again, as we saw, is very much from his words and his worship. And again, also his personal relationship with God. So, yeah, so that's the final slide. But I'd like to kind of just leave you with a scenario again with the two words. It's really character, legacy, and serving. So it's maybe the time now as well as we look at the book of David is also maybe to start serving. So maybe you serve in church at the moment or you serve in some capacity, but it's sometimes good to serve, or it could be voluntary work as an example. It's very good to serve because obviously there is benefits from serving. And I think it's also a good Christian witness as well. But the legacy, I think, here as well is obviously we need to consider the kingdom culture on a day-to-day basis, who we're actually serving. We're a servant of the King. We need to do his mission and will on earth. And I think really, as you look in your life now towards, towards the end of your life, it's always good to plan and think of a legacy. So what do you want to be remembered by? But also, what do you want the Lord to remember you by? That he's given you gifts and skills. And I think particularly just lastly, when I read the daily devotional, it's sometimes we need to then question and ask the Lord, what gifts and skills do I have? And how can I use them for the Lord's purpose? And that's today's sermon.